All right. Welcome back, folks. Hope everyone had a good weekend. And today we're going to discuss the Apology and Credo from Socrates. Again, Plato's dialogues, the Apology and Credo. But we're going to talk about them as if they were Socrates' philosophy that we're learning about, because really in these dialogues, Plato is trying to more represent Socrates' views, and we will then start to turn our attention to the Republic, which is Plato's his kind of grand text of his own that he writes later in his life, and that really represents his own mature, independent thought, which is less about representing Socrates and more about Plato's own views. Even though in the Republic, Socrates continues to be the main character, but now he's more of a fictional character in the Republic. Than he is here at his trial in the Apology. John, you have a question to start us off?
Yes. How can we be sure that these writings actually are what Socrates would have thought and aren't just being used by Plato to push
Yeah.
his own ideas?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we can't necessarily be sure about this, but we do know that the trial happened. We know that Plato was there. We know that Plato was kind of a loyal follower or student of Socrates. Now there are actually different kinds of accounts from the time of the trial and of Socrates, and so who Socrates was, is certainly going to be contested, and for our purposes, the it's less important who Socrates was historically and more about the ideas that we're going to grapple with here. So the focus, I mean, we're doing a quick kind of discussion of these texts. And so focused more on the ideas, and we'll talk about whether the ideas and arguments shift at all between the Apology and Credo to the Republic. And so we'll talk about that, whether there's a shift in thinking there that might represent a difference between Socrates and Plato, or whether, it's all just kind of Plato's own rendering or his own views. But um, uh, in any case, we're not going to get too hung up on the historical question of the truth of who Socrates was and his belief, and more about the kind of ideas that are represented here in the text. But for a shorthand for our way of kind of speaking about the ideas in the Apology and Credo versus the Republic, we'll kind of make an artificial distinction and talk about Socrates for the Apology and Credo, and we'll talk about Plato for the Republic, just for ease of our own conversation, and to be able to flag any differences between the texts. But it's an important question you're asking. I don't mean to sidestep it. We're just not going to really focus on that particular question. We're more focused on the arguments and ideas that come out of this text. Okay, so we've got a lot to cover today. We will jump right in, and I'm a little bit behind already in class number 3 here, but we'll hopefully be able to catch up pretty well today and be back on track. I also want to just remind you that tutorials are starting this week, and in fact, that means they're starting today because we have a couple of tutorials on Tuesday. So please make sure you um, know where you're going, and you have the Zoom link for your tutorial section to be able to go at the right time to meet your TA and your classmates there. Okay, so I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint here as usual, and we'll get started. Okay. Now, as I said, left off saying last class, by the apology, what is actually meant by that word in this context is something much more like defense rather than apology. Socrates is not apologizing for his actions or his way of life. He is defending his actions and his way of life. And in fact, he uses the charges that he's been brought up on as a kind of springboard for offering a kind of explanation and a defense of his philosophical way of life, the life of the philosopher. And so we see here in this text, he actually thinks the charges against him are quite spurious, that they are not really grounded in any kind of truth, and that a lot of his accusers, he thinks, actually know this, but they're just kind of out to get Socrates. They don't like him. They find him annoying. They are consider him kind of one of this kind of group of sophists who are seen as kind of corrupting the city as it's kind of in a period of waning, declining power and influence and prosperity. Um, Athens is kind of declining in these ways at this time, and so the sophists are the kind of are ones that are being blamed, and you see the charges that Socrates is brought up on are kind of those that are associated with sophistry, the idea of teaching children manipulative rhetoric, which um, is very harmful for a society like Athens, who which is based so much on the assembly and collective decisions made in the assembly as a democracy. So so Socrates thinks, the charges are quite easily refuted, and he used the opportunity of his trial, his kind of defense at his trial, to kind of offer much more of an explanation of the way of life that he has lived to this point. And so we're going to break down a number of the elements of that philosophical life that Socrates explains and defends in this text. Okay. So the first element that I want to pull out here is a kind of ancient Greek word or concept that doesn't appear in our translated version of the text, but is an important concept nonetheless to Socrates and the Greeks at this time, and that's the concept of parrhesia. And it can be roughly translated as something like fearless speech, courageous speech. It also has a connotation of plain speech and blunt truth speaking, like blunt speech, plain speech that's very forthright and very honest and courageous and kind of speaks truth to power. And so you can actually see that Socrates begins his defense here in the Apology with a kind of defense of parrhesia. He says right early on in the text, on the first page of the Apology, he starts off the text. I don't know, men of Athens, how you were affected by my accusers, because of course we're coming into the dialogue here after his accusers have spoken and Socrates is now given the chance to speak. So he starts, I don't know how you were affected by my accusers. As for me, I was almost carried away by them. They spoke so persuasively, and yet nothing they said is true. And so Socrates goes on to then say, um, uh, sorry, he says again, here's this 17b, just a paragraph down, a few lines down from the beginning. He kind of says, oh, they were speaking in very kind of clever language. And he says, um, whereas from me, you'll hear, he says, they said little or nothing true, whereas from me, you'll hear the whole truth, but not by Zeus, men of Athens, expressed in elegant language like theirs, arranged in fine words and phrases. Instead, what you'll hear will be spoken extemporaneously in whatever words come to mind, and let none of you expect me to do otherwise, for I put my trust in the justice of what I say. After all, it wouldn't be appropriate at my age, gentlemen, to come before you speaking in polished artificial language like a young man. So he just starts off with this idea, I'm going to speak plainly, I'm going to speak truthfully, I won't speak in these fancy kind of what he calls kind of embroidered phrases the others speak in. Um, so again, he's distancing himself from the kind of rhetoric and oratory that the sophists are kind of well known for, and that um, people are using in the assembly to kind of convince others. So the first kind of thing to notice here is this idea of plain, blunt, truthful speech. I will speak plainly, truthfully, not in fancy ways, not in sophisticated ways. So the sophists speak sophisticatedly. Um, so that's the kind of first concept we want to that comes into the picture right away at the beginning of the apology. He starts by talking about the way he will speak, not the content of what he will say. Second crucial element of Socrates' philosophical way of life that he will defend here in the text, and again, this isn't come in all in kind of chronological order here, but I'm reconstructing, pulling out these main elements and putting them back together. Second is what we might call, again, another Greek term here, elenchus, the elenchus, and that is what we often understand as the Socratic method. It is a philosophical interrogation of questions and answers where Socrates invites someone to make a claim, what they take to be true, and then he subjects it to kind of rational scrutiny and questioning. And so the elenchus is a crucial part of Socrates' method and his way of doing philosophy. Now, what's interesting is that this text is much more of a monologue in most of it because it is Socrates defending himself. However, Socrates didn't quite work in monologues most of the time. He thought philosophy should be done in dialogue, as I mentioned last class, and it should happen in this kind of space of questions and answers, claims and counterclaims and kind of scrutiny of those claims. And so in much of this text, we don't actually see his Socratic method, this method of questioning and answering in full effect. But we do see it at one point when Socrates is able to call one of his accusers, and that accuser's name is Meletus, to kind of subject Meletus to cross-examination. And so he calls Meletus up to kind of reiterate the claims, and Socrates kind of subjects his claims to scrutiny, to rational argument, in order to show that Meletus doesn't actually believe, or doesn't actually believe what he claims to be saying, or doesn't it or that just what he's saying doesn't stand up to any rational scrutiny. And so we get a brief glimpse of the Elenchus method here, but we will see much more of it, of course, in the Republic as we go forward, where Plato will write in this style, in this dialogical style, and you'll see the questioning and answering happening a great deal as we move forward. But we get a flavor of it here with his cross-examination of Meletus. Third element of the philosophical life that Socrates defends here is that, and this, of course, is again in response to one of the charges against him, which is that he doesn't believe in the gods of the city. He's essentially a kind of atheist and is kind of blasphemous or sacrilegious as a result. And in defending himself along these lines, Socrates actually makes a claim that his philosophy, his practice of philosophy, is in fact done out of a sense of piety or a sense of religious duty. So there isn't kind of a division here for Socrates between philosophy and religion, but rather a kind of joining of the two, where Socrates thinks his rationality, his scrutiny, rational scrutiny of others, is actually based in a religious duty to the gods, a performance of loyalty, of piety to the gods. And he articulates this through a really crucial story that comes early in the text. And that is a story of the Oracle of Delphi. And so it is in telling this story that Socrates kind of talks about how and why he came to practice philosophy, and why he goes around questioning people and showing them and showing others that these people don't actually know what they claim to know. So anyone out there kind of recall can tell us briefly what the main kind of story is about the Oracle, how this kind of story unfolds, at least at the beginning, or how the Oracle kind of leads Socrates to kind of questioning people? John, yes, thanks.
If memory serves correct, he is specifically told by the Oracle of Delphi that no person in Greece is wiser than him. So, and he doesn't believe that. So he just goes from town to town to town to town to village, debating as many people as possible to try and find someone who is actually wiser than he is. And he keeps getting disappointed when he doesn't find them.
Very good, very good. A couple of things. So it's not he's not told this directly, but rather an acquaintance of his is told that the Oracle has kind of sent this message through its this kind of medium figure who kind of speaks on behalf of the Oracle, and so that that kind of person tells an acquaintance of Socrates that the oracle has said this, that Socrates is the wisest. And Socrates doesn't, yeah, as you said, he doesn't really believe it. He doesn't understand it. And so he wants to, but he doesn't, because of course there's a kind of sense of piety here that the oracle, the oracle kind of speaks on behalf of the god or whatever. And so there's a sense here that that the god must know what they're saying. There must be a meaning, there must be a truth behind what the oracle has said. And so Socrates wants to understand the message. And so not really thinking, not really understanding himself to be the wisest. And that it seems particularly unclear to him because he says, I don't claim to know anything. How can I be the wisest if I don't claim to know? Others claim to know. I don't claim to know anything, so I can't be the wisest, could I? Like how, what does the oracle mean? And so he goes out to kind of discover the meaning and of course to prove, he says at one point, to prove the God irrefutable, to show that the God always speaks the truth. And so Socrates goes out and he decides to speak to all the different people who claim to have knowledge. So he goes out and speaks to the poets and the politicians and the craftspeople and different artisans. He talks to all different kinds of groups who either think they have knowledge or are reputed to have knowledge. And all of these people, he finds, have some kind of skill. They're good at something. And yet that leads them to kind of overinflate their knowledge and their abilities. They have some specific skill, and yet that leads them to think that they are very knowledgeable overall, that they are so it fills them, in other words, with a kind of hubris. And so he's examining all these different groups. He goes from one to the other, and he gets them to like say what they know. And then he subjects their claims to scrutiny. He finds that they don't know what they claim to know, that they are really filled with falsehood, that even if they have some particular knowledge or some particular skill, that they actually are filled with falsehood because they're filled with this kind of hubris about things that they think they know because they have some particular talent that is kind of untrue. So he slowly discovers, as he's going around examining people, that they don't know what they claim to know. And so it leads to his uncovering of the truth of the oracle's message. And that is the truth that Socrates is wisest because he knows what he does not know. In other words, he is not filled with the hubris. He's not filled with the falsehood about things that he thinks he knows about but doesn't. He is wise in this kind of ironic sense that he knows what he does not know. And that is what we can call a kind of Socratic wisdom, the knowledge of what you do not know. And sorry, I skipped a point here that essentially what he in his questioning of others and showing that others don't have the knowledge they claim to have, he is doing a service to the gods. He is honoring the gods. He's showing the gods to be irrefutable by showing that people don't know what they claim to know. And so philosophy becomes a kind of service to the gods. And it's a service to the gods that helps to instill more Socratic wisdom. Now, he doesn't call it Socratic wisdom. Actually, what Socrates calls it is proper human wisdom. He says to really know, to attain true knowledge, is almost something for the gods to have. Human beings don't really have access to that kind of pure knowledge. What human beings have is the search. They have the search for knowledge. They have the questions. They have the pursuit of knowledge. But they never really fully grasp it. All they can do is kind of reach for it, strive for it, keep working towards it. And that is kind of godlike behavior. It's godlike activity. It's kind of a divine activity. But the kind of wisdom human beings are limited to is this knowledge of what you do not know. So he says, this is true, proper human wisdom, he says, to know what you don't know. And the other way of thinking about it is that this is a kind of humility, and it's what we might call epistemic humility. In other words, it is a humility about knowledge. It's a humility about what we can know, or what we can or do know, or not know, or cannot know. That humility is crucial for human beings. It's a virtue to, um, in opposition to hubris, intellectual or epistemic hubris. It is a virtue to have a kind of humility as a human being, because again, human beings don't have full access to true knowledge. The gods have that. That is godly. That is in the realm of gods. But human beings, they pursue knowledge, they search for knowledge, and that kind of helps nurture their souls, which is the divine part of them. But they can't really fully achieve it. So they have to maintain a kind of humility at all times to be able to keep searching. So this is what Socrates calls human wisdom, what we call in the wake of the trial of Socrates Socratic wisdom, just like we call the Elenchus the Socratic method. So this humility is really crucial, and it is what Socrates is trying to spread in the city by showing that people don't know what they claim to know. He's showing them they need to have more humility, which will keep them on the path of the learner, of the student, of the seeker of knowledge. And you can just flag here. I've pointed you towards the kind of lines of the text. Again, these are the marginal 19b to 21d. This is the paragraph or line numbers that you see in the margins of the text, which kind of help us to hone in on particular parts of the text a bit more specifically than the overall kind of page numbers of the textbook. So I'm pointing you towards those sections of the text. 19b to 21d is where he talks about this Socratic wisdom, this human form of wisdom or knowledge that is contrasted with the superhuman or godlike knowledge that that humans might claim to have but don't actually have. Okay, a fifth element of the philosophical life that Socrates defends here in the Apology, and that is poverty. Socrates says in a couple different places, I've pointed you towards the parts of the text here, he mentions poverty several times. And he talks about how he lives a life of poverty. And of course, on one hand, this is a simple refutation of the claim that his accusers have made, that he has made all this money from teaching false things, from corrupting the young, that he is materially gaining, financially gaining from teaching falsehoods and teaching corruption. So on one hand, it's the claim about poverty is a simple kind of refutation of this, but I think there's a little bit more of a significance to this as well. And it's interesting to pause on, I think, because poverty actually plays an important role in lots of different spiritual and religious traditions, where the idea of like shedding material wealth, living in poverty, or at least very simply, that is a part of godliness. It's a part of morality. Now, so if we pause on this for a moment, why might this be? Why is it that, and again, I'm not necessarily just asking about Socrates' views here in the Apology, but why is it that in lots of different traditions and different moral or religious traditions, why is poverty seen as sometimes as virtuous? What is it about that, about poverty, that you can kind of make this claim, or what does poverty show in some way? Yeah, Jordan, thanks.
Yes, thank you, Professor. Sorry for the background noise.
That's okay.
I was thinking that poverty is important in virtue because you sort of see the world for what it is and you're not clouded by your illusions. That's kind
Mhm.
of what I thought.
Yeah, very good. But what do you mean exactly? If you can pause you for a second, like what do you mean by the illusions? What is it? Uh,
I guess like just like your identity, like in the context of like what Socrates was doing, like this guy, like say he debated a politician, and what he realized was like, or what I realized was the guy that is said to live in poverty, Socrates, came out smarter than the politician.
mhm.
And but this identity of being a politician sort of hindered his ability to see that he could not compete with Socrates' mentor.
Okay, okay, very good. Yeah, John, let's hear from you.
Yeah, the two religions that specifically come to mind in this instance are Christianity and Buddhism. And there are um, similar reasons for why poverty specifically can be seen as virtuous in such religions. In Christianity, you get a lot of these ideas of wealth and the excessive hoarding of wealth as being innately sinful. You have the idea that it is more easy for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter heaven. You have the story of Jesus flipping over the tables of the merchants in the temple, for example.
So
And
there's something kind of morally corrupting about wealth, about
yeah,
okay,
and
yes.
in Buddhism, you also see the very corrupting influence of material possession. That is the thing that keeps you in the cycle of samsara. That is the thing that keeps you suffering and in the cycle of birth and death
Yes.
and suffering. And only by getting rid of those material possessions, getting rid of that attachment, can you actually get nirvana.
Excellent. Very, very good. Okay, Leighton, let me hear from you.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good.
I am just sort of thinking about this, like from a Christian perspective, through this teachings of I don't know if you know Saint Teresa of Lisieux and her concept of the little flower, where it's God exists within the little things in life, but in order to see the little things in life, you have to strip away the material values of this world to truly appreciate and to truly take in all the
Hmm.
precious little things that are existing within you, not just within the world, but within yourself.
Yes. Okay, very good. So there's this sense here that, and again, this is something that's picked up in lots of different traditions that is also part of Socrates' kind of philosophical way of life here, where there's something corrupting or clouding about material wealth. And so, and certainly that is something that will come up in the text and that Socrates will claim. He says to the people of Athens, you are too consumed by these other things. And you need to care more about the most important things, which we'll talk about shortly. So there is something morally clouding or corrupting about wealth, and poverty is kind of a way of getting outside of that. But there's one other aspect of it that I would kind of also point out, and that is that poverty is also seen as, in many ways, a sign of sincerity, of commitment, of integrity, in the sense that if you can show that you are not materially benefiting from something, then that must mean that you are much more sincere in your belief of that thing. Because, of course, when someone materially or financially benefits from something, we start to question, are they actually sincere about their belief in that thing? Or um, is it just what makes them money? Is it just what's financially lucrative to them? And so, a way of demonstrating a kind of sincerity is to give up the spoils, to not accept the spoils of something, to show and prove your kind of dedication and your sincerity of your belief, of your practice. And so Socrates also seems to mean something like this in his kind of his valorization of poverty here, where he um, talks about the fact that, yeah, you can see that I have not benefited materially from this, and therefore from my practice, and therefore you can know that I sincerely believe this, that I am not doing this because it brings me some other reward. I don't know what number I'm on, maybe a sixth element. Is the idea that's very, very central to Socrates' practice, and that he extols several times in his apology, his defense here. And that is the idea of doing what's right and avoiding or actively opposing what's wrong or what's unjust, without care for living or dying. What Socrates says repeatedly here is like, we should pay no mind to living or dying. We should only seek to do what's right. That is the crucial commitment of the philosopher. He says on 28b, Socrates says, but perhaps he's paraphrasing someone else. He says, perhaps someone may say, quote, aren't you ashamed, Socrates, to have engaged in the sort of occupation that has now put you at risk of death? Unquote. I, however, would be right to reply to him, you're not thinking straight, sir, if you think that a man who's of any use at all should give any opposing weight to the risk of living or dying, instead of looking to this alone whenever he does anything, whether his actions are just or unjust, the deeds of a good or a bad man. So he says, you should pay no mind to living or dying or these other rewards. You should just seek to do what's right and to avoid doing what's wrong, to avoid injustice or oppose injustice. That is what you should care most about. That is the philosophical task. And that is why I have kind of claimed last class that for Socrates, philosophy is actually at its heart a kind of moral practice. We often think of philosophy as just kind of, oh, being able to play devil's advocate or think about ideas and pontificate about, but for its own sake. But like, that's not how Socrates thinks of it. So for Socrates, philosophy has a moral task at its core to do what's right. It's not about thinking. It's not about knowledge for its own sake or thinking for its own sake. It is about when you actually know something, for Socrates and for Plato, when you actually know something, you live it in your actions. And so for him, the claim here is that you need to live this truth. You need to put it into practice by doing what's right and avoiding what's wrong. And you should, in doing so, not care about material rewards. You should not care about punishment, living or dying, but rather should just simply seek to do what's right. That is the task in front of us. Yeah, John, you have a question.
So, according to Socrates, would that mean that all aspects of philosophy, from metaphysics to epistemology to aesthetics, are based in ethical moral philosophy?
They are very deeply tied together for Socrates and for Plato, that the way Plato will put it, and it's through Plato that we get a better kind of fuller exploration of these things. The way Plato will put it in the Republic, as we'll see in a few classes, is that it's the moral goodness that kind of is like the light that illuminates all other forms of truth. That ultimately at the heart of all forms of truth is moral goodness. So yes, all of the forms of knowledge are rooted in ultimately a kind of moral truth for Socrates, ethical truth, that's kind of like the root of it in the soul.
And so would that make the pursuit of knowledge moral in it of itself?
yes, it is a moral task because there is no separating of gaining knowledge and kind of um it's kind of more practical moral element. So if to read, this is what I was saying a moment ago, is that to really know something is to live it in a sense, is to act on it, is to so it's never simply just something in the mind. It is about the whole body and the whole practice, the whole soul being oriented towards that truth. And so short answer is kind of is yes to your question, but very good question. So don't care about living or dying, just care about doing what's right. So this is that kind of moral impetus. And it's also, again, last class, I kind of talked about where Martin Luther King Jr. draws inspiration from Socrates, the commitment to doing what's right, even if the law is unjust and the law kind of compels you to do something else. You have to obey the higher law, God's law, the moral truth, and do what's right, even if it's at risk of your own comfort or well-being or punishment or what have you. That is crucial. Jordan, you have a question.
Yeah, I was just sort of making a connection. I think it was Bertrand Russell who said he would rather be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Because although, like the pig, like he lives a good life, he eats, he rolls in mud, he doesn't have the human ability to sort of think and question and doesn't have the ability to do the right thing. And I think for Socrates, his life was like all about just, as you said, just doing the right thing and questioning things. And I think that's innately what makes one of the most important things about being human. So,
Yes,
yeah,
very good. And that kind of quotation ties together two different ideas. One that we see in the Apology that we'll talk about in a moment, which is that the unexamined life is not worth living. Probably the most famous quotation coming out of this text is this passage from Socrates. You see it quoted often. The unexamined life is not worth living. So you get this kind of sense, but also it also ties together another metaphor that is used in the Republic, that Plato uses in the Republic, where he will talk about kind of the idea of a pig being satisfied and how that is not a true human existence. That is kind of like an animal existence, but it's not what human beings are capable of is something higher than a life of a satisfied pig. And so that metaphor will actually come back into play very soon. We'll see it in another class or so. So that quotation that you cited is kind of drawing on a couple of these Platonic and Socratic ideas. The last element here that I want to pull out of the philosophical way of life for Socrates is the idea of um, caring for your soul. That the philosopher is trying to get others and is trying themselves to care for their souls, to nurture and tend to your soul. For Socrates and Plato, the idea here is that your soul, and in fact, this is a broader thing about kind of ancient Greek worldview and philosophy, is that the soul is the divine part of you. And so that is the part of you that makes human beings different from animals for them, and that is like the divinely inspired part of you. And so it needs to be tended to, it needs to be catered to. because otherwise, why would we have it? And so you need to tend to and nurture your soul. And that is the most important thing. The soul, the divine part of you, is the most important thing. And so you have to care for that. And so Socrates goes around and he says one of his main tasks has been to try to get people to do this, to try to get people to stop caring so much about the shallow and superficial things and to care instead for the most important things, to care for your soul. He says, and this is let's see, where am I? 29D. Yeah, D, I guess E, I've said 29E here. Maybe that's it. Maybe that should be 29D. It starts a bit earlier, but um, he says, I won't give up practicing philosophy, exhorting you and also showing the way to any of you I ever happen to meet, saying just the sorts of things I'm accustomed to say, quote. And this is so he's paraphrasing what he tells people. My excellent man, you're an Athenian. You belong to the greatest city, renowned for its wisdom and strength. Are you not ashamed that you take care to acquire as much wealth as possible, and reputation and honor, but that about wisdom and truth, about how your soul may be in the best possible condition, you take neither care nor thought? And then he goes on to say, then if one of you disagrees and says that he does care, I won't let him go away immediately, but I'll question, examine, and test him. And if he doesn't seem to me to possess virtue, though he claims he does, I'll reproach him, saying that he treats the most important things as having the least value, and inferior ones as having more. So here he's kind of offering this claim that Athenians, maybe human beings generally, care more about wealth and honor and reputation. They get caught up in these things and they degrade or devalue the most important thing, your soul. And they don't nurture the soul and through virtue, moral virtue is what cultivates and nurtures your soul. And so he says you have to care about the most important thing. Um, and so it's in doing so that you will kind of live the philosophical life by caring about your soul, kind of trying to get others to care about their soul. That is the life of the philosopher. And this leads into a conversation. Sorry, John, I'm gonna have to keep going here. I'm gonna have to just push ahead. Sorry. And then I'm already up against the break. We'll take the break in just a moment here when I finish this thought or a couple of points here. This leads into a point that Socrates makes about the philosopher as a kind of gift to the city. That in fact the philosopher is someone to be thanked and appreciated for doing this task of getting people to care about the most important thing, to care about their souls, that is a gift for people because in fact that is what keeps your soul healthy. And for again, Socrates and Plato here, if your soul is in a good condition, that will lead to your happiness. That leads to a kind of sensation of a good life, not just the idea of a good life, but the feeling of a good life, of a happy life. If your soul is in a good condition, you kind of live contentedly. And so the philosopher is a kind of gift to the city, Socrates goes on to say. And he says, yeah, the city should think of me as a gift. The task that the gods have given me to examine people, to compel them to care about the most important things. That is a gift to the city, and people should treat it as such. And the gift comes in the form of a gadfly, a pest. This is why it's sometimes hard to see it as a gift. But, and again, this metaphor of the gadfly is what Martin Luther King Jr. referred to in the letter from Birmingham jail that we talked about in the previous class. That it's actually the philosopher is a kind of pest, a gadfly, a kind of horsefly that pesters the horse and keeps them awake or wakes them up from their sleep and annoys them, that he's kind of swatted away, but that is playing a very crucial role of waking them up from their sleep, of that the sleep that you can be lulled into through material goods and reputation and honors. That is you can get caught up in that, but the philosopher keeps you out of that. And so he says on 30e, it's just as such a gadfly, it seems to me, that the god has attached me to the city, one that awakens, cajoles, and reproaches each and every one of you, and never stops alighting everywhere on you the whole day. You won't easily find another like that, gentlemen. So he says it's a kind of gift and you should appreciate it. And this also leads into eventually the idea that I mentioned a few moments ago, and that is crucial to Socrates's philosophy and the practice of philosophy that he's extolling here, the idea that the unexamined life is not worth living. Again, one of the most famous passages that come out of the Apology is this idea. And it goes back to what we've said previously, that for human beings, the task is to search, the quest for knowledge, the examination itself is the task, the questioning, the seeking, the pursuit of knowledge. And that knowledge, again, is not just the idea, but it's the knowledge that you come to live, you come to practice. So the unexamined life is not worth living. You can't live a happy, contented life if you get lulled into these material things and reputation and honors, and you think that's the most important thing, and you don't tend to your soul. Happiness, contentedness will come from living a good life, will come from nurturing your soul through the examination of philosophy, the questioning, the pursuit, the philosophical life, the examined life. Okay, let's take our break now. Let's take 10 minutes. It's 1:30. Let's come back at 1:40 and we'll pick up a few remaining points here from the Apology before then leading into the Credo, which kind of picks up where the Apology leaves off. Okay, so let's take our 10 minutes and I will take a couple questions here as well. Okay, so we left off with our final element we want to bring out about the several elements of the philosophical life that I wanted to kind of highlight here. Now, of course, we are in this class, this is a class of political theory and not just philosophy more broadly. And so we are interested in some political questions here. In fact, that's our main focus. So, and as I've mentioned numerous times now, in the first half of our course, we are going to be focusing quite a bit on the question of the relationship between morality and politics. So we have seen here that morality is really at the heart of the philosophical life that Socrates is defending here in the Apology. So the question then is, if the moral life, moral commitment, moral truth is so central to Socrates, what does it mean for politics? What does that mean for the political life? How does Socrates see the relationship between the two? And it is a theme that comes up in the text, so we want to bring that out next. In other words, what is the relationship of the examined life, the philosophical life, in other words, which is a moral life, or at least the pursuit of a moral life ahead of anything else for Socrates. What is the relationship of that to politics for Socrates? And his answer is pretty interesting. And it comes through his kind of discussion of again, many of his own experiences in what he calls the public realm in Athens. So let me break down a few things he says about the relationship of philosophy to politics. First, one thing he argues that philosophy involves questioning others, saying and doing what is just, and avoiding or opposing what is unjust. We've seen all that already to this point. But the point then in relation to politics is that it can, all of this questioning of others, doing what is right, opposing what is wrong, that can therefore lead you into or involve political dissent and disobedience. So there is a part of the text in which Socrates says, I'll obey the gods. When I'm doing this philosophy, I'm obeying the gods. They have given me this task, and I will obey the gods rather than you, men of Athens. And he also tells some stories about various times where he stood up to the assembly or stood up to the powers that be. At one point, he tells a story about how the assembly wanted to do something that was illegal in Athens, to try these generals as a group rather than individually, and that the assembly was all up in arms and was wanting to do this kind of illegal action. And that Socrates stood up and said, no, this is wrong. And he says he would have been put to death, or it would have been persecuted or put to death for that if some circumstances hadn't happened shortly thereafter. So it's just kind of luck or a fluke, circumstantial, that he didn't get punished for standing up to the assembly. He also tells another story where he was at one point, the democracy in Athens had fallen and it was being ruled by a set of tyrants. And they ordered Socrates and a few others to go bring in this guy Leon to be punished. And that they thought this, and that Socrates thought this was wrong. And so he tells the story about how he was ordered to go bring Leon in, and he refused. He went home. And again, he says he would have really suffered if those tyrants, their rule hadn't fallen shortly thereafter. He would have been punished. And so, again, philosophy leads you, this commitment of philosophy to doing what's right and avoiding injustice, perhaps even actively opposing injustice, that leads you into political dissent and disobedience. And this is evidenced by Socrates' own examples of his own life. Second element here that is worth kind of highlighting again is that philosophy generates great hostility from others. This is evidenced by not only the examples I just raised, but throughout the text where he talks about where he goes out and examines people and they get more and more angry. He notices that as he examines them, they get more and more agitated, and he basically says that it's because of this that has led him to this trial today. That the very fact that people are trying to persecute him in this trial and bringing him up on these false charges is because people don't like him, because he's examined them and shown them to not know what they claim to know. And so philosophy generates great hostility, either in itself through the examination and showing people that they don't know what they claim to know, or also through your example, through your dissent, through your disobedience. That also brings about great hostility. The third step here is that Socrates argues that this hostility that your philosophy, your dissent, your disobedience generates leads to the persecution and punishment of the philosopher, often in resulting in their death. And so he says repeatedly in the text, do you think, men of Athens, that I would have survived if I had lived a political life? And he says, no, I wouldn't have. He says on 31d, he says, for you may be sure, men of Athens, that if I tried to engage in politics, I'd have perished long ago and have benefited neither you nor myself. Please don't resent me if I tell you the truth. The fact is that no man will be spared by you or by any other multitude of people if he genuinely opposes a lot of unjust and unlawful actions and tries to prevent them from happening in the city. On the contrary, anyone who really fights for what's just, if indeed he's going to survive for even a short time, must act privately, not publicly. So this last passage leads to the final part of the point, which is the conclusion to this thread of argument, which may be a bit surprising. But Socrates kind of concludes here, he argues here when he's talking about politics, that in fact the philosopher should avoid politics. that philosophy should be practiced in private. What he means in private is like outside of the assembly, in small groups, it's still out in the open, it's still in the public square, it's out with others, but it's not in the political institutions, it's not in the assembly, it's not in public in that sense. So Socrates actually argues here in this stretch of the text that the philosopher should not live a political life, that they should avoid politics. And so in the end here, what we see is that Socrates actually argues for a kind of separation of the moral life and the political life, that philosophy, or more the moral practice of philosophy, is actually at odds in some way with politics, and that therefore the philosopher should actually avoid politics when they can, seek to stay out of it. And so there's a kind of oppositional relationship between the moral life, the philosophical life, and the political life for Socrates. And this leads us to the kind of close to the end of the Apology. And here, of course, I'm showing an image not from the Apology, or from of Socrates, but of course, some of you may recognize this classic scene from the original Star Wars film. And I bring this up because it always reminds me of the way the Apology ends, or vice versa. The Apology reminds me of the way this scene in Star Wars. And it's that Socrates ends the text with a kind of prophecy that is similar to one that, for those of you who've seen this scene, Obi-Wan Kenobi makes here in his fight to the death with Darth Vader in this scene. Let me see if anyone wants to humor me here. Does anyone remember this scene and what Obi-Wan says to Darth Vader here at this point in the movie? Yes, Sophian, I haven't heard from you yet. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. I literally just rewatched this movie like last week. So,
Good,
uh,
good timing.
yeah. So wait, okay, I remember. Yeah. So like, yeah, several lines in the fight, but Obi-Wan says, "You can't win, Darth. If you strike me down, I shall become more powerful than you can possibly imagine."
Exactly. Very
Yeah,
good.
looks to his left at Luke. Then Vader strikes him down. He disappears.
Yeah.
Yeah, so on and
So
so forth.
this kind of line that you can't win. If you kill me, I will become more powerful than you can imagine. This is kind of like what Socrates says at the end of the Apology. He ends with what he calls a prophecy that, again, the gods have given him, and that is that this kind of idea that he has actually been holding back the young people who have followed him around, that the young men of Athens, especially the sons of the rich, they enjoy watching Socrates, they enjoy following him around, and they enjoy philosophy. And they have been kind of held back because Socrates been the one doing this philosophical work, and they've just watched him. And he says, now, if you strike me down, if you kill me, then no one will hold back these young people any longer. They will go out and they will examine you, and you won't hold philosophy back. In fact, philosophy will become much more powerful if you try to kill the messenger, kill me. Philosophy will be unleashed upon you. And then, in fact, this is a kind of good thing, and Socrates kind of talks about that in the end here he gets a sign. He feels that maybe his death will be a good thing. Um, uh, and so this is kind of how he ends the apology, by accepting the fact that he has, and also I skipped over the fact that, of course, by this point, he has been sentenced. He has been found, no, he has been found guilty. And then he is kind of sentenced to death. So in the apology, they kind of show how the kind of the jury deliberates, he is found guilty, he is given the chance to kind of speak for an alternative, like what kind of punishment he deserves. He gives this kind of cheeky response that in fact he should be given free meals at the gymnasium where the Olympians and all train, where the athletes train. He says, I should be rewarded. And so he is kind of sentenced to death. And that's when he kind of offers the kind of prophecy that ends the text. It also kind of brings back a certain thread of the storyline where Socrates has said earlier in the text that, like, we sometimes fear death, but fearing death is an example, he says, of like the kind of hubris that he is trying to rid people of. That in fact, we shouldn't fear death because, and again, that's part of what gives us courage, the moral courage to do what's right, is if we don't fear death. Because we shouldn't fear death because we don't know what death is. And so when we fear death, it's like we're acting like we know something we don't know. It is part of that hubris that we talked about earlier. And so we shouldn't fear death because we don't know anything about it. And so, and we can't really know about it. And therefore, we should proceed as if it could be as wonderful as it is terrible. We don't know. And so it again lends to this this idea of like, okay, he accepts the fact that he will be put to death, and that's kind of where the apology concludes. Now, that leads us forward to the Credo, the second dialogue, which picks up right where shortly after where the apology ends. And so what has happened at this point is that Socrates has been sentenced to death. And he is awaiting his death sentence. He's awaiting the ceremony in which he will be put to death by drinking the hemlock, the kind of poison that will kill him. And so he is being held in a cell, awaiting. There's some things that they're waiting for in order for this to happen. A ship has to come in, not important. And so Socrates is kind of imprisoned, waiting for his death. And his friend, Crito, comes to visit him. And Crito has, along with Socrates' other friends, he has devised a plan. He's paid off the guards, and they've devised a plan to break Socrates out of this and to whisk him away to another place where he can live out the rest of his life without being put to death. The point here is that Crito says, a great wrong has been done to you. This is unjust. So let's get you out of here. Let's preserve your life. let's get you away to somewhere else where you can live out your days and take care of your children. Socrates has some kids, and he says you can take care of your children, and we can kind of fix this wrong this injustice that has been done. And so Socrates says, okay, Crito, sit down. Let's talk about this in classic Socratic fashion. Socrates says, let's figure out whether that would be the right thing to do. Because that's all we should care about, whether it's the right thing to do. That's the task of the philosopher. Would it be just to leave? And so the dialogue here becomes a question about escaping or remaining. But more importantly, it becomes a question of obedience or disobedience, to obey or disobey this verdict of the city, of the jury, the people of Athens, that they have given. And so it becomes a text about this question of obedience or disobedience. And given what we've seen in the Apology, you might be somewhat surprised to hear what Socrates ends up arguing. And the fact that he provides this argument here in the Crito, which in some ways seems to stand in at least some tension with some of the things he has said in the Apology, is one of the puzzles that we need to think through, and that has puzzled lots of people reading these texts through the centuries. So let's unpack a little bit about some of the key arguments here in the Crito. And ultimately, as you will have seen by now, Socrates will argue that he should not escape, and that he should instead accept his punishment and obey the law. So he will deny Crito's claim, and he will remain, and will in fact be put to death. So what are his arguments for doing so? Let me just pull out a number of them. One argument that he makes is, of course, a simple one that he starts off the text with, where Crito is saying, think about your friends, think about your kids, think about, all of these things. Think about the fact that a wrong has been done to you. Think about all these things, and let's get you out of here. And Socrates suggests that, no, actually, I shouldn't think about any of those things. I shouldn't think about my kids, because what matters, or I shouldn't think about my friends or my kids or my family, because what matters is whether what I'd be doing is right. And furthermore, it doesn't matter whether a wrong has been done to me. The question is whether what I would be doing would be right. And what Socrates wants to say is a basic version of two wrongs don't make a right. He argues to Crito that doing an injustice, just because an injustice was done to you, doesn't make it right. It's still an injustice. So again, two wrongs don't make a right. If it would be wrong for me to escape, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter whether I'm doing that in response to a wrong being done to me. So then he has to figure out whether it is in fact wrong for him to leave. And he ends up arguing that yes, it is wrong for him to leave. And the first argument, what he does here in the text, as you'll have seen, he basically kind of starts a kind of imagined dialogue with the laws of the city. Basically, like he's kind of personifying the laws and structures and institutions of the city. And he's saying, imagine we were speaking with them. What would they say to us about this? And he says the laws would basically say to us that to disobey their ruling would be to attack the very foundation of the city. What they say to Socrates, again, Socrates is saying to himself here, but he's like channeling the kind of laws of the city or the gods of the city. He's kind of saying, is it possible for a city to survive if people just think willy-nilly that they can obey and disobey whenever they want, that they can disobey the verdicts and judgments of the city whenever they think a wrong has been done to them? How would a city ever survive if people had that kind of lax attitude towards obedience, towards the laws and verdicts of the city? He says it couldn't. A city couldn't survive in that case, and therefore, to disobey the city, to disobey the verdict here of the city, would be an attack on the foundations of the city itself. So here, this is on 50b of Crito. He's again paraphrasing in the laws in this imaginary dialogue with them. They say here in this imaginary dialogue, quote, "Tell us, Socrates, what do you intend to do? Do you intend anything else by this act you're attempting than to destroy us laws and the city as a whole to the extent that you can? Or do you think that a city can continue to exist and not be overthrown if the legal judgments rendered in it have no force, but are deprived of authority and undermined by the actions of private individuals?" So private individuals can't just like flout the laws and their verdicts. You can't just do that. That would destroy the very foundation of the city. The city can't survive with that kind of attitude from private individuals and those kinds of actions. And so Socrates says that is an attack on the city. And that is wrong in a sense. And he goes on to say why it's wrong. And essentially what he argues is that the city is like a parent. The city is a natural superior to the individual. And therefore, the individual has no right to retaliate against their natural authority, their natural superior. So the argument here is like, yeah, when you have a superior in a hierarchy, and your superior can punish you, but you can't punish them. You don't have that right as the inferior party. And so the idea here is, again, a larger worldview here in Athens at this point, which is the city is the individual is merely a part. It's a minor part of the city. The city is the most important thing. The city is the most important unit, the collective, not the individual. In our modern context, we tend to reverse this more and to think that the individual is kind of paramount, the individual's freedom. We tend much more to believe that the individual is more supreme, and that the collective shouldn't tell the individual what to do unless like necessary, unless the individual is going to harm others or something like that. But the idea here is that for the Athenians here, that the city is the most important thing in political life, and the individual is kind of much less significant. And so Socrates provides an argument here about the city being kind of like your parent. You owe them everything. They have brought you up. They have educated you. They have nurtured you. They have made you what you are. You can't retaliate and attack them. You owe them everything. You are not in a position to punish them, even though they might deem it necessary to punish you. So that is another kind of reason here why it is wrong, Socrates argues, it would be wrong to disobey the city and to escape its punishment. The fourth argument that we can pull out of the text here is an argument that we actually will see in a bunch of different ways. It kind of appears in lots of different contexts. And that is the idea of like, if you consent to something, you participate in something, then you are kind of making yourself beholden to that system. If you benefit from it, you choose to be part of it, you benefit from it, then you are in some ways you have an obligation to that system. And what Socrates argues here is that the city provided you with an opportunity to either persuade it or to leave. You had that choice. You had the institutions were in place for you to defend yourself at trial. You were given that right to speak in your own defense, to try to convince the jury, and the jury didn't side with you. But you were given that opportunity to convince and persuade the city. Furthermore, Socrates argues that he actually had lots of opportunity to leave the city before he was brought up on charges or anything. He had the opportunity to leave the city if he didn't like it and its laws and its system. That he says, I could have gone elsewhere. I could have gone out to the countryside and lived or moved to another place, but I didn't. He says, I in fact stayed here more than others. I didn't even travel. He says, I hardly left at all. I lived my life in Athens. And so in doing so, I gave my kind of approval, my consent to the laws and to the system. And so now I am kind of obligated to accept its verdict, its punishment, because I had the chance to persuade it, I was unsuccessful, and I had the chance to leave previously, and I didn't. So I stood for trial, and I now am beholden to its judgment. That is also, building on what I've said, that also is related to this point. You give your tacit consent and agreement to obey the laws by living in and benefiting from the city. And so if you give that consent, you benefit from those laws, then it is unjust after the fact to seek to attack those laws and to flout them and undermine them. And finally, Socrates argues in the very end of this dialogue, and he doesn't elaborate on this at great length, but he says at one point, again, the laws say to him, he's channeling the laws, and the laws say to him, if a wrong has been done to you, Socrates here, that wrong was done by human beings. Fallible human judgment. The members of the jury. Those are human beings who can make mistakes. Those are human mistakes and human injustices. But that's not an attack. That's not an injustice done by the laws themselves or the institutions themselves. It is an injustice done by human beings. But if Socrates were to escape, he would be attacking the laws, the institutions of the city, the system of the city, not just the human beings who had poor judgment. And so it would be a much graver, it wouldn't be an appropriate response to an injustice done by human beings to attack and undermine the whole city. Humans have made, if there's a mistake that's been made, humans have made it, not the laws, not the city. And so here there's a reverential attitude from Socrates towards the laws, the city, the kind of, you have to think of the city here as like the cities has its gods, the city has its kind of its laws that are kind of divinely ordained by the gods. So you can think of this as like there's a reverence towards the city. The city has almost a divine character as well. And so that's how Socrates speaks of it and how he thinks about the question of obedience and disobedience. And why he says, no, I have to obey and I have to accept my punishment and I have to remain. And that's the argument that he makes in the Credo. Now, this leaves us with a couple of puzzles about this text, and we're going to come back to this. We'll start next class with this point, but I just want to point out these couple of points here, and then I'll just put them on the table. I want you to think about them, and then we'll discuss them at the beginning of next class. Because there's two big tensions that come out of reading the Apology and Credo. One is the one we were just talking about, the question of obedience. In Credo, Socrates seems to provide a kind of absolute argument that the law is always to be obeyed. And yet, in the Apology, as we saw, he seems to allow room for the fact that in order to do what's right, you have to disobey sometimes. So the question is, why does he seem to offer arguments, or how does he seem to offer arguments both for strict obedience and also that allows room for disobedience? Okay, that's one puzzle I want to leave you with and come back to next class. The second puzzle or question that these texts kind of raise for us is the question about participating in politics. Socrates seems to suggest we should not participate in politics because, he says, we'll be persecuted and put to death as truth seekers, as morality seekers in politics. You will be persecuted and put to death, he says. And therefore, he says, the philosopher should avoid politics. But wait a second. Socrates has also told us one of the main arguments in the Apology was you shouldn't care about living or dying in deciding what your actions should be. So how is it, why is it that he can say avoid politics because you'll be put to death when he has told us over and over again, don't pay any mind to living or dying, just do what is right? these are two puzzles I want to leave you with. And like I said, we will come back to these questions at the beginning of next class, and then we'll jump into Plato's Republic, our next text and our first kind of really big full text that we are going to tackle in the class. Okay, so we'll leave it there for today. And I will see you on Thursday. Have a
Thank
good
you.
couple of
Thank
days,
you.
folks. Yep.
Have a good day, Professor.